Hello, International Master Andrew Martin here, and welcome to this Foxy Openings DVD on the Accelerated Dragon. In Volume 1, we're going to be looking at the Maroxy bind. And that formation occurs after the moves e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, now g6, reaching the Accelerated Dragon, whereupon white plays c4. Now, any player who wants to employ the Accelerated Dragon is going to have a good system against the Maroxy bind. Basically, white is hoping that the pawns on c4 and e4 exert a cramping influence on black's game, which prevent him from breaking out as marked in the diagram with moves such as d5 and b5, typical freeing moves. This approach by white is positional, strategic, and has been very successful over the years. Black has often struggled to find effective active play against the Maroxy bind. Basically, players of the Maroxy bind don't try for too much out of the opening. They just want to create pressure via space. White controls space. He effectively develops his minor pieces, his queen and his rooks behind the pawns on c4 and e4, and only then does he start to come forward. And black must play carefully so as to avoid not being cramped. Now, on this particular DVD, which is volume 1 in the series, I'm going to recommend two systems for black. One of which is sharp, the second of which is mainstream. And you can choose between each. We're going to look at the sharp system first, which is risky, but I think when it's well chosen in a tournament game, you needn't play this every time, perhaps you could employ it as a surprise weapon, could well score plenty of points for you. And it occurs after the move bishop g7, hitting the knight, bishop e3, defending the knight, and now knight out to h6. This is a very rare guest in master play, and as I say, as a surprise weapon, it could prove very effective. Black's play is controversial. The knight moves to the edge of the board, but the point of this move is to keep the f-pawn free to go. So in a lot of lines using this system, black is getting ready to break with the move f5. This leads to sharp play and very interesting play too. Perhaps white, if he knows everything, can negotiate the complications and come out with a better position. But how many of your players, how many of your opponents will know everything? This is the main question. Of course, if you don't like this system, then you can perhaps employ the main line I'll be suggesting a little later on. But for the time being, let's transport ourselves all the way back to 1957 now, to the Russian Championship between Grandmasters Foreman and Boris Spassky, playing with white. And in this game, white played knight c3, whereupon black castled. White played his bishop to e2. This is by far the most common square for the king's bishop in the Maroxy bind. And as you can see, the attractions of the Maroxy bind are obvious. White gets this nice formation, easy development for his pieces, and plenty of space. But now black tries to break up the bind with f5. As white has so unpleasantly stopped the other breaks, b5 and d5, black resorts to the very sharp pawn attack on white's centre, f5. And now battle is joined. This coming game will show us conclusively how the surprise weapon can work in black's favour if white doesn't know what he's doing, or he panics as a result of this early advance on the king side. Foreman took on f5. Well, if we go back, we can quickly see that black is actually perhaps threatening to go f4 in this position, which would be uncomfortable for white. So white's probably got to take. And now Spassky plays another unstereotyped move here. Bishop takes d4. This is a further point to the black system. Foreman took on d4. We just dropped back. We will be looking at the consequences of bishop takes h6 in our next game, but for the time being, let's see bishop takes d4 first. And now black plays knight takes f5. So the black knights are exerting uncomfortable pressure on white's centre, in particular on the dark squares, and white's got to resolve what he wants to do with a bishop on d4. Foreman decided to retain his bishop with bishop c5. Black hit the bishop one more time, and white dropped his bishop back to a3, whereupon Spassky put his knight in on d4. So, in return for having surrendered the two bishops, Black's got a nice outpost on d4, which he's going to be very reluctant to surrender. In general, long term, the prospects favour White. If White can ever get this dark square bishop going, then I think, you know, he can count on a very good position. Black's job is to disrupt him with tactical blows to make sure that he does not ever get the chance to get this bishop into the game decisively. So White castled. Black brought his bishop out to f5. Now Black's certainly thinking about knight c2, so White played rook c1 to stop that. And Spassky played queen to d7. Actually, the location of that bishop on a3 is not that impressive, because it means that Black's rook on f8 is, well, unmolested really. White would really like to have his bishop on h6 in this position, attacking that rook, but the bishop's a long way off. And this gives Spassky the time to mobilise his pieces further with rook f7, b3 trying to bring the bishop back into the game, and rook a f8. So this will be a typical way that Black tries to mount pressure against the White king side. Foreman moved his bishop back to attack the Black knight, and of course Black wants to keep that knight in on d4. The knight on d4 is shutting down the dark square bishop. Black would be delighted really if White took that knight, because, well, you just take back, and then Black really couldn't get rid of that knight on d4. So White tries b4, trying to break up the formation of the knights. In fact, b5 is on the agenda, followed by a capture on d4. Bishop e6. Bishop d3. Foreman obviously doesn't want Black taking off the bishop on e2. And now Spassky goes into action with bishop g4. All along the line, Spassky is disrupting White's plan. And, well, after f3, he unleashed a sacrifice here with bishop takes f3. This obviously gave Foreman a bit of a shock, because White's one move away really from controlling this game. If he could go b4 and b5 and then bishop takes d4, I think he'd be in very good shape. But Spassky's just in time here with this sacrifice to disrupt White's flow. Well, king h1 was played. Now clearly if White considers that knight a really serious threat, I think he's probably got to take it. After that, Black will recapture with the rook, and now we've got a situation where White has extra material, but he's not in any position to use it. Black, meanwhile, has nasty threats to White's king. Perhaps rook f2 is a threat, perhaps queen g4 is a threat, perhaps e4 is even a threat. The White king is extremely open, and, well, who's to say the rook and two pawns are not better than the two pieces in this position? Evidently Foreman didn't like that, because in the game he parked his king on h1, but that runs straight into queen h3. I think basically what happened in this game is that Foreman overlooked Black's next move. He thought rook f2 was going to save the day, but now comes the crushing move, knight e1. This is a decisive double attack, and in fact, so strong is this move that White decided to resign. Let's take a look at why White resigns. Well, basically because he hasn't got a move. The rook on f2 is kind of overloaded here. Black has several threats. He's hitting the rook. He's hitting the bishop. Obviously, if rook takes f7 in this position, Black has queen g2 checkmate. And going back to knight e1, it's hard to see another move. For instance, if he plays rook d2 in this position, Black has a number of winning moves. I think knight takes d3 is pretty effective. And then we can push the rook down there to f1, queen takes f1, rook takes f1, rook takes f1, queen takes d3, and again Black is winning on material. There's nothing in knight f6 check at all. So that is a typical example of how Black may confuse the issue in this line. Particularly notable was the easy way Spassky built up pressure once he'd driven the dark square bishop out of the game. I think once Black plays bishop takes d4 in this line, the die is cast. He's simply got to hunt down the dark square bishop and shove it out of play, and then get to work against the king side in a similar way to which Spassky did. I mentioned in game 1 that the system we are examining is a risky and very sharp way to play against the Maroczy bind. which now brings us to the game Dragan Barlov versus Victor Manuel Vehi Bach. And this game was played in Portugal in 2003. Barlov is a grandmaster playing white, and Vehi Bach is an international master playing black. Although the opening was a reti, it quickly transposes back into the accelerated dragon. You often find this with the accelerated dragon move order, that it can occur even after d4 from, for instance, Benoni move orders, things like that. So there are a lot of transpositional devices within this system to reach our desired position. And Barlov played bishop e3, after which knight h6 was played by Vehi Bach. Vehi Bach has actually had pretty good results with this line. I think he chooses the right moment to play it, essentially. And this is a skill you will have to cultivate with black if you play this opening with any regularity. You're going to have to choose the right opponent at the right time. Because what we're going to see in this game is essentially a very strong continuation for white. Not necessarily the line that Barlov played, by the way. Barlov lost this game with white. But I'll show you the line which should trouble black if white plays perfectly. Of course, you know, chess is a practical game. This need not put you off. You know, you've got to find ways of trying to win games with black in a chess game, and lots of grandmasters have employed this line with black simply because they feel it gives them practical chances, and that, I think, is what we're seeking. Well, we reach the main line position after bishop e2, black castles, knight c3, and now black hits out with this very sharp move f5. As I said, it's hardly profitable for white to allow the move f4, so Barlov takes on f5, bishop takes d4, and now the critical move, bishop takes h6, after which black really has only one move to maintain momentum, and that's rook takes f5, whereupon white castles. Okay, well here we have a rather unbalanced position. Inherently, of course, white's position is much sounder. He's got the sounder pawn formation. Black has 3 pawn islands to white's 2, and that bishop on h6 does look ominous next to the black king. Nevertheless, what happens after queen b6? This is a very sharp move, which I think is going to shake a lot of your opponents if they haven't seen this line before, because black's already hitting the pawns on f2 and b2. White must know exactly what he's doing in this position, or he's going to get an awful position, as happened in the game Meligas versus Vehi Bach, which was played in Vlissingen, Holland in 2001. White played queen d2, seeing no way to prevent a pawn from going down the drain here. Black took on f2, and then he played d6, and white was obviously relying on knight d5 to bail him out. Well, black has won a pawn in this position, and Vehi Bach confidently went queen d4 here. After bishop d3, there came rook f7, and after rook d1, black played bishop g4. The game continued, rook c1, knight e5, and black was well on top and went on to win. For instance, after rook c3 as played, Vehi Bach actually played the very sharp move rook f3 in this position, when it's anybody's guess what's going on. Going back to rook c3, if you want to play a stable move, which keeps black a pawn up and white has really no compensation, then just play rook e8 here. Which brings us all the way back to Barlov versus Vehi Bach, where the grandmaster continues with the best move, knight to d5, and black, having said A, queen b6, has got to say B now and come in with queen takes b2. Well, I think most white players here are going to play as Barlov did, rook b1, but that's not the best move. Unfortunately for black, if white knows knight takes e7 check here, which is quite a difficult move to see, then the black position is not so great. This is the risk you take when you enter this variation. And the point of this piece sacrifice is that after knight takes e7, white goes rook b1. And the queen can't maintain the defence of the dark square bishop on d4. Of course, once that dark square bishop goes down the pan in this position, with the white bishop so close to the black king, then I think black is going to emerge with a very poor game. I give 2 variations. Black can obviously take on f2, and then he can play queen e5. But after bishop f3, d6 and now rook b5, the black game is actually quite ropey. White has 2 bishops in an open position, and I don't like black's position very much. Black can defer the sacrifice with queen c3. White goes rook b3. And now probably the best move for black here is queen a1. But even here, after rook takes a1, I still think white is substantially better with his pair of bishops. So really it's up to you whether you take that risk. If you play this variation, then that's the risk you're going to take. A small risk, but well, you have to go in with your eyes wide open. As it happens in this game, white played rook b1, queen a3, and now bishop g4, hoping to work up compensation after rook f7 and now knight c7. Rook b8 was played, and white went knight b5. But queen c5, the game continues. White gets the chance to lop off that bishop. But after queen d4, black is reaching a playable position. Still a pawn up. White hasn't got his pawn back yet and shows no signs of doing so. And so white has it all to prove in this position. And in the game, Barloff actually doesn't manage to prove it. He plays queen e2. Well, clearly white could exchange the queens in this position. And maybe retreat his bishop with bishop e3, something like that. But that is the type of continuation which can only really give white equality at best. I mean, I think black just safely retreats his knight and retains his extra pawn. Yes, white has two active bishops, but he's a pawn down. And I quite like black's chances here. So Barloff obviously did not consider that a practical continuation. He went queen e2, keeping the game on the boil. And black retreated his queen out of the centre with queen f6. I think it's obvious that a period of consolidation is going to be called for here, careful consolidation, over the next few moves. And Vehibach is up to the task as he gradually dampens white's enthusiasm for playing this position. White's trumps are the pair of bishops and his activity. Black's main trump, of course, is his extra pawn. B takes c5 was played. Bishop takes c5. Obviously, white can take on b8 in this position. Knight takes b8 and only then take on c5. I'm not sure it makes an enormous amount of difference. Black brings his knight back to c6 and remains a pawn up. Something similar happens in the game. He goes bishop takes c5. Black takes on b1. And then the rook comes back to f8. Bishop e3 was played. And now finally black gets the chance to strut his stuff a bit in the centre with d5. Now I think black's passed pawn is going to win the day. White reluctantly trades off his light square bishop and plays rook c1. But rook d8 is a good move, getting in behind the passed pawn and again, you know, saying to white, well, what actually have you got here? White frees up his back rank, and now another very good consolidatory move by Vehibach, rook d6. He's getting ready to push his pawns with e5. Bishop c5 was answered by rook e6 and queen d2 by d4. White goes rook d1 and now black plays another very good move here, queen f5. Bishop a3. Well, of course, bishop takes d4 here will be met by rook d6, which is a very unpleasant pin for white to meet, and white can't resolve it by playing a move like queen c3 because he runs straight into e5. So bishop a3 by Barloff, queen e4, bishop b2. It's the same story as in the first game actually. The dark square bishop is eventually run out of play. Queen e2, bishop takes d4, knight takes d4, queen takes d4, and now a move which I'm sure Barloff found slightly surprising. Perhaps he was in time trouble, perhaps he couldn't see any way to meet it. Rook d6, skewering the queen to the rook on d1. White resigns. So we see from this game that this is a practical choice by white, the knight h6 variation. It's a sharp line, it's unclear, and well, if white knows everything, he probably gets the better position as we've seen. This should not deter the creative competitor. Well, now the good news for black, the further good news, if you like playing this line with knight h6, is that black might not be forced to give up his dark square bishop so readily. So let's turn to the game Ferguson versus Turner, which was played in the Oakham Masters in 1994. At the time, I think both of these players were international masters. Matthew Turner has since gone on to become a grandmaster. He seems to like this line with black. And we quickly reach a familiar position after bishop e2, when black actually delays the move f5 by playing d6 first. White plays knight c3, black castles, white castles, reaching a typical position, and only now does black play f5. And the point of this move is that when white takes on f5, black's going to recapture with the knight. So this is much less committal than the bishop takes d4 line, but perhaps black is playing for less high stakes in this line. We're going to reach a position after knight takes f5, bishop takes f5, where really this position is a question of taste. Strategical white players might like the slightly better white pawn structure, and the fact that, you know, black's light squares in the centre are slightly weakened, but tacticians are going to like black's raking bishops and the prospect of putting pressure on white's queen side, notably on b2. Ferguson's a very good strategical player, so it's interesting to see Turner adopting this line against him. So white played queen d2. Black brought his rook into the game with rook c8, knight d5 by white, and now black plays e6. This, to my mind, is a very practical variation by black. Black plays this line when he wants to win games. It really is as simple as that. You don't play this line to make a short draw. It's an unbalanced position. It's very, very sharp, and you play it when you need to play flat out for a win. Ferguson didn't like the idea of retreating his knight straight away and played bishop g5. White forces black to find a location for the queen. I think queen d7 is the best, in fact the only location, and knight e3 was the point of white's move. So white is going to obtain the bishop on f5. Yes, but black gets his stronghold on d4. It seems to be a theme in this variation to try and push white's dark square bishop out of position, after which black hopes to make a gain in the centre, maybe even to conquer the d4 square for good. Ferguson took on f5, black took on e2, and after queen takes e2, rook takes f5. At every stage in this line, black is keeping white at bay with tactical chances. White retreats his bishop to e3, and now black gets on the case with b5. C takes b5. Queen takes b5. Queen takes. Rook takes. And white played rook a d1. Well, clearly this is a critical position, and as white has no really effective way to defend that pawn on b2, bishop takes a7 has to be another possibility. I'm sure against that black was going rook a8, bishop e3, and now bishop takes b2. Well, this is an unclear position, perhaps rook a d1, but now I think d5, and white has some problems with his pawn on a2. So you see, it's not that easy for white to avoid slipping in to some sort of bad endgame in this position, simply because black is so active. So in the game, going back to the position in the game, Ferguson played rook a d1, and rook takes b2 was the move. We got a different version of the last endgame here, where it was actually black who obtained a passed a pawn rather than white. Rook a8. So everything's going to hinge on whether, you know, white has enough activity to actually prevent black from just pushing that a pawn all the way up the board. It's very convenient for black that the queening square is on the same colour as his bishop on g7. That bishop on g7 is ideally placed. First, white has to do a little bit of tidying up at the back, so he plays g4 to let his king out more than anything else, and black starts the pawn rolling. Nothing complicated about what black's doing in this position. He's just pushing that pawn for all it's worth. So white, having given his king some room, brings his rook to c1, and he wants to play his rook to c7. That's completely clear. So bishop f8, both attacking the rook, gaining time, and preventing white himself gaining time after rook c7. Rook d7 was answered by a3. This is black's default plan in this position, just pushing that a pawn if he can't see any direct threats by white. In comes the white rook. Rook e2, getting ready to push the pawn even further, and Ferguson plays rook a7, which I'm sure is correct, getting his rook in behind the passed pawn. But on with the show. King f1, rook b2, and now here's the move white is relying on, Bishop d4. White is seriously hoping that this move is going to save the day. Well, we will see. Rook d2. An excellent tactical move, nudging the bishop out of position. The bishop is actually curiously overloaded here, defending both against the pawn advance and a tactic on the f2 square, which we're going to see coming up as after bishop c3, black unleashes rook takes f2 check. That was the point of the whole idea, and white went king e1, a rather miserable move, but of course if he goes king takes f2, bishop c5 check, king e2, bishop takes a7, and I think this bishop ending should be fairly comfortably won. White's problem is he's got to look after the pawn on a2. This is going to enable the black king to come into the centre and hopefully eventually to invade on white's king side. The white king can't really defend against, once the black king gets to d5, black's twin threat of coming into the king side and just marching up to the queen side to prepare the advance of the pawn. This will be a lost endgame for white. So going back to rook takes f2, king e1 was played, but another pawn goes down the drain. And now it's hard to imagine that white is going to save this position, 2 pawns down, despite the fact that the black king is as yet to enter the fray. g5, very good. Point of this, bishop takes g5, bishop g7. There's also a1 equals queen. This perhaps is more convincing. The skewer wins. So, king d1, h6, bishop c3, bishop c5, black's gradually pushing white back, rook a6, bishop f4, anchoring the bishop. It's a slow, steady, methodical process, but inexorable. Eventually white has to let the king out. Well, I think black's simply threatening to win that pawn on g4, and then he'll have 2 pawns against 0 on the king side, which again should be a fairly simple win. But there's no problem with time in an endgame like this. You know, black's got all the time in the world, and so he tortures white for a few moves. He keeps him at the board. You know, he keeps him guessing as to his intentions, and you know, white gets more and more fed up with his position. Eventually, makes a decisive mistake. Not that this position isn't lost anyway, but letting the king out makes it easier, of course. King e1, bishop d2 check. That's a nice move to finish off. White was really running out of ideas here. You might say, well, he doesn't need to play king e1. Okay, you're right, but then what else does he play? Black is certainly going to find rook g2 and then rook takes g4, given enough time. But king e1 is game over, bishop d2 check, and again the bishop's overloaded. White resigns. Bishop takes d2. Well, we just give a check and queen the pawn. Very simple. So let's go on to take another look at this line where black plays f5 and takes on f5 with the knight. It seems very reasonable. Let's go on now to take another look at that line where black delayed the move f5 for a little while. He played d6 first. And the next game comes from the Ukrainian Championship, Kiev, in 1958. And it shows the effect, really, of casual play by white. Playing white in this game is a guy called Stolyarov, playing black the famous grandmaster Yefim Geller. Black played d6, white played knight c3, typical Morocco stuff, and now Geller played his knight out to h6. White played bishop e2. Note that black is probably thinking about going knight g4 in this position, so bishop e2 is a must. Both sides castle, and now black breaks with f5, reaching the typical position for this line. Okay, white takes, black recaptures with the knight, preferring not to surrender his dark square bishop, although that has advantages too. White takes on f5, bishop takes f5, queen d2, and now Geller brought his queen out to a5. This is another interesting way of deploying the queen in this line. Rook a c1. You know, when you look at that move, you think, well, is black really threatening bishop takes c3 in this position? Sometimes he is, sometimes he isn't. I would say black's plan in this position is probably rook f7 and then rook a f8, with chances along the f file. But white decides to cut the idea out of bishop takes c3 at any point by playing rook ac1, another standard Maroczy move. And now Geller just gets on with the plan of rook f7, which seems very reasonable. That is, of course, unless white gets a move like c5 and then bishop c4, and black's got to be careful of that idea. But there's no prospect of that just yet. Incidentally, another move that has been played in this position is bishop e6, which takes the idea of c5 right out of white's mind. If then bishop h6, as recommended by Andrew Greet, we take it and we go rook f7. And this seems like a pretty reasonable position for black to me, with rook a f8 coming up. If queen e3, attacking the bishop on e6, then black can play queen e5. Again, with a very reasonable position. White takes, black recaptures, white plays b3, black moves his rook across. What is wrong with black's game here? Nothing as far as I can see. So that may be a reasonable alternative to Geller's rook f7, which incidentally works very well. White went b3, black swung his rook across to f8. You can see the attractions of this line, active play, all pieces in the game. Yes, white has a superior pawn formation, but, you know, black's active play compensates, without any doubt. So Stolyarov moves in to take off the dark square bishop. Black takes, dragging the white queen out of play, and then he plonks his knight in on d4. That's always a drawback for white in this line of giving up the dark square bishop, surrendering the central dark squares. Geller's very quick to notice this, being a connoisseur of fianchetto positions. After queen e3, e5 of course, keeping the knight in there, and bishop f3 was answered by bishop e6, bishop e4, a6, knight e2, and Geller takes on a2. I don't know whether white thought the flurry of tactics coming up was going to favour him. Queen takes d6, but it turns out black can play bishop takes c4, and that's a move I think probably white thought was impossible. Black's main trumps now, of course, are the queenside pawns, especially that passed pawn on a6. White probably thought to himself, well, he can't take on c4 here because I'm going to take on c4 and fork him. But the problem with this continuation is that Geller simply has queen c3 here. And with king g7 coming up, white is running out of steam. Now black has two passed pawns on the queen side, and, well, really, no, white's got nothing to stop him with. So actually, this was the game continuation, and Stolyarov resigned. I don't think black can be prevented from playing king g7. So white will have to take on f7 at some point. Okay, rook takes f7, and what does white have here? Nothing whatsoever. Going back to the critical position in the game, after queen takes d6, bishop takes c4, can white do better? Well, he probably can with rook fe1, and then rook takes f2 is the move that goes for broke. Once again, we see that rook takes c4 isn't working here due to the splendid move rook f1 check. And if rook takes f1, queen e3 check, winning immediately. But I think after rook takes f2, white might be able to do better with queen d4. Sorry, excuse me. Queen d4. Forking the bishop on c4 and the rook on f2. If bishop e6 then, we go bishop f3. That's the point of white's play. Probably best for black now is rook takes f3 and then rook takes f3, braving the complications. White can play rook c7, and I think that forces the pace. Black probably has to go rook g3 check. And after h takes g3, queen takes g3 check. Well, there are two ways of forcing the draw. White's got to play king h1, and then of course queen h3 check forces the draw immediately. We should note that, going back to queen takes g3 check, there are several white pieces on pre. So that has to be taken into consideration. This variation will probably have led to a draw. But as it stood in the game, bishop takes c4, rook takes, queen takes, bishop d5, queen c3, just won straight away. So another game where black negotiated the strategical complications and came out on top. Well, we've seen a few games now with this sharp approach. So I think what I'd like to do is just to summarise the theory such as it is on this line. Black should certainly start, in my view, with knight h6 straight away. This gives him the option of playing the line with f5 straight away, or playing with d6. White normally plays knight c3 and black castles, reaching the basic position for this line. If bishop e2 by white, then I think black has two options. He can lash out, as Spassky did, with f5. This is an interesting line and reaches a very dangerous position after e takes f5, bishop takes d4. Bishop takes d4, knight takes f5. I believe this position to be playable for black after bishop c5, d6, bishop a3, and then knight fd4, and follow the Spassky game earlier with bishop f5. Everything hinges on whether white's dark square bishop can be kept out of the game for long enough for black to arrange active play. We saw Spassky doing so with queen d7, rook f7, and rook a f8. I believe this to be a playable position for black. Going back to bishop takes d4, if you play this line, considerably more critical is the line with bishop takes h6. This may amount to a direct refutation of black's idea, but the game remains very sharp. You'll recall in the game Barloff versus Vahy Buck, white castled and black played queen b6, white played knight d5, and now Vahy Buck went in for queen takes b2. When, if white finds knight takes e7, and it's not guaranteed that he will, then black's position is not that great. The point of knight takes e7, as you recall, is to overload the black queen. She can't retain her control of the dark squares, and in particular her protection of the bishop on d4. Going back to knight d5, you might have wondered what happens after bishop takes f2 check. Well, once again, the refutation is tactical and quite difficult to see, but it's there. Bishop g4, and now the crushing move, which again people are not guaranteed to find, knight takes e7 check. This remarkable move actually puts black in a terrible spot, because if he goes knight takes e7, white has a remarkable move, bishop e6. So this variation is interesting, but perhaps rather dodgy from black's point of view. However, you will win lots of games with it. Now, going back to the position after castles, bishop e2, we saw in the Geller game and the Turner game that black could actually delay f5 by playing d6 first, and only now does he play f5. This is a less sharp approach, and black intends to get his knight off the edge by playing knight takes f5 in this position. After knight takes f5, bishop takes f5, it's an open question as to whether white can exploit his advantage of the better pawn structure. That's all he's got in this position, because black is very active. After queen d2, black, in my opinion, has two decent moves. He can play queen a5, or going back, he can play as Turner did with rook c8. Either of these moves gives black adequate chances. So there you have it. You have a choice between the razor-sharp Spassky line and the more solid, but, well, let's say safer line espoused by Turner and Geller. Before we leave the subject, I'm going to go all the way back to knight c3 castles. I should mention the move f3, which has also been played, another way for white to prevent knight g4. Then international master Andrew Greet recommends the very sharp move queen b6 in this position, trying to exploit white's slight lagging development and his hanging pieces on d4 and e3. Note that b2 is also en prise. This move could well cause confusion in white's camp, and white's probably got to move one of his knights here. This is an untested continuation. In fact, in the chess-based megabase with nearly 4.5 million games, I could not find a single game with this continuation. There are two lines. If white plays knight c b5, note the knight on d4 is pinned. Queen a5 check. And now, however white plays in this position, I think black gets reasonable chances. For instance, if he goes bishop d2, black goes queen d8. And it's doubtful whether white has anything better than playing bishop e3 in this position. If he insists on originality with queen c1, we have knight g4, f takes g4, knight takes d4. And suddenly the tables are turned in terms of pawn structure. Going back to the position after queen b6, if knight db5 here, then that's a terrible mistake. Black comes in and chops off the bishop on e3. Finally, after queen b6, white can try knight a4, but now queen a5 check, and if king f2 in this position, well, black can even get on the case with f5. This is a typical move for this way of playing, and exactly the move black wants to play. So if you feel, how can I put it, in a sharp mood against the Maroczy bind, you can try this line. It is possible to play it in several different ways, as we've seen, and I imagine that this system will score pretty well for you in practical terms. I'm now going to go on to consider one of the main lines against the Maroczy, which is much more soundly based, but of course we're not playing for such high stakes. Well, now, I can quite understand that not everybody will like ultra sharp play right from the beginning of the game, so for you I'm going to recommend another variation against the Maroczy, the classical main line. This position will arise in the Maroczy bind, the main line, where white plays c4, black brings his knight out to c6, attacking the knight on d4, white defends, and now knight f6. No fancy business with knight to the edge of the board, just common sense development, hitting the pawn on e4. White defends the pawn, and now black castles. I'm not sure what could be simpler or more effective than that. Bishop e2, d6, white castles, and now black has to find a plan, having completed, let's say, the preliminary stages of his development. Black can't enter into this position without some sort of idea of what he's going to do next. Otherwise, white's pawns on c4 and e4 confer on him an undeniable advantage in space. Planless play by black here will result in a very passive position. Fortunately for black, he's got a good idea in taking off the knight on d4, which in itself is logical because it eases any cramp by exchanging pieces. White recaptures with the bishop, and now bishop comes to d7. Well, that's not a mindless development. The bishop's on its way to c6 to pressurise the e4 pawn, and after that black will look to develop his major pieces to their most effective squares. White has had a hard time proving any advantage against this plan. We come now to the game Benjamin Bock versus Kjetil Lee. The black players graded 2-5-4-7, and this game was played in Vaikansei in January 2010, where white played the mainline move, queen d2, and black continued with his plan, bishop to c6. White reinforced this pawn on e4 with f3, and now black played a5. Well, at this stage we need to know what the strategy is for black in this line, because a5 looks like a slightly peculiar move. Alright, well, in general, black is looking to effect favourable exchanges of pieces here. One piece he'd like to get off the board is the dark squared bishops. Thus, with a5, black's planning to retreat his knight to d7 and offer the exchange of bishops. If white obliges, black tends to get a grip on the dark squares. That's black's aim in this position, to grip the dark squares. The move a5 also restrains white on the queen side. One way white can play to increase any advantage that he might have in this position is to advance the queenside pawns. This takes quite some time and involves a painstaking manoeuvre involving something like rook b1, rook c1, b3, a3 and eventually b4. But if b4 comes, then black can feel very cramped. So black's got to be aware that the biggest danger to him in this position lies in the advance of white's queenside pawns. Black, meanwhile, well, he looks to effect favourable exchanges of pieces, and as I've said before, play on the dark squares. So the next few moves are logical. White plays b3, just protecting the pawn at c4 and starting that plan rolling. Black plays knight d7, and white doesn't want the exchange of bishops, thank you very much. He feels that he should keep the pieces on, as he's got slightly more space. Black plays knight c5, that's a good outpost for the knight. And now white stations his rooks effectively. Rook a b1, and he's going to go through with that plan. Rook c1, a3, and then b4. Lee finds an interesting rejoinder. He plays e6, an active move. Seeing a possible weakness on d6, white trains his rook on that square, joining up with the queen to attack d6. But with bishop e5, black continues his onslaught on the dark squares. Of course, white wasn't threatening to take on d6 just yet, because the knight on c3 hangs. So for the moment, black is hanging on and deploying his pieces actively. The bishop on e5 is actually pretty well placed. It's unwise for white to play f4 in this position, because then his pawn on e4 will be very weak. So Bock played bishop d4. This to me is a slightly paradoxical move, but it's evidence, I think, that white's running out of ideas. White could have exchanged dark square bishops a couple of moves ago. He refrained from doing so. Now he's offering the exchange again. Well, black played queen e7. Entrench your pieces on dark squares in this line, and not much can go wrong. White played bishop f1. Of course, one of the big dangers to white in a Maroczy bind is that he ends up with a very poor light square bishop. Note that all of white's pawns are on light squares in this position, so white really doesn't want to be left with a light square bishop in some sort of horrible endgame. Black often enjoys endgames in this structure because of that horrible light square bishop, so that's another real reason why white should go through b4 as quickly as possible, to try and liven up the queenside pawns. Well, okay, Lee played rook a d8, which again is a very sensible move. White played queen e3, and now black decided to take off the dark square bishops. And he wouldn't have done that if he hadn't had a follow-up. And the follow-up was e5. We've already seen this plan in the other Maroczy bind line that I showed you earlier, and it's a very logical move. Black is trying to gain the dark squares once again, and in particular, the square d4. White retreated with rook d2, and now black played f5. I suppose going back, black could have considered the move knight e6 in this position. Perhaps he was slightly worried about white putting his queen on b6, something like that. At the moment, black's knight stops the white queen from coming in and attacking the potentially weak a pawn. So Lee decides to break with f5. This, of course, hits white on the long diagonal and chips away at the white pawn centre. So white takes, black recaptures with the pawn, and white plays f4. And now, only now, does black go through with his plan, knight to e6. This looks like it might be a mistake, as white takes on e5, but black's got it all planned. He now played the counter-attacking move f4. This actually is a very good game to start off with, because it shows us how black might attack in this line. Lee played d takes e5. Now white can't take on e5 because the rook on d2 is hanging, but he thought he saw a flaw in black's plan by taking on d8 first. Lee played queen c5 check, queen f2, and now rook takes d8. So logical and sensible play by black all the way through, and I think black has a slight advantage with his strong control on the dark squares. White trains his sights on the e5 pawn. Black takes on f2 and plays his rook into d2. Very consistent all the way through. Of course, perhaps the biggest danger to black, if there is one in this endgame, is the white queenside pawn majority. So that's another factor in Maroczy bind positions that has always got to be kept in mind. Of course, black is holding white at bay in this position with his very active pieces. Black's got by far the better bishop, he's got a central pawn majority, and now he's got an active rook, which white seeks to exchange with rook e2. Just going back, if king g1 here, well, the idea behind that is clear. White wants to take that pawn on e5. I think black can play knight d4. And if rook takes e5, black continues to charge in with f3. This is a very awkward position for white, as black's pieces are ferociously active. I wouldn't like to be white in this situation at all. So white avoids that and heads for what he thinks is a reasonable endgame after rook e2. Black captures, white recaptures, and now black plays e4, gaining space and getting ready to bring his king into the game. I imagine black's plan is something like king g7 and then bring the king up the long diagonal into the centre. White tries to activate his queenside pawn majority. Black plays e3 check. Why not push the passed pawn? King f1, and now the king starts his march. White plays b4, very sensible. Black takes, reducing the number of pawns, and up comes the king. b5, bishop e8, bishop f3, knight d8. It looks as though black is being pushed back in this position, but appearances are deceptive, as we will see. Up comes the black king. Knight d5, knight e6, king d3, and now knight d4. The activity of the black pieces is the most important feature of this position, and black continues to become more and more active after knight b4, bishop g6 check. King comes to c3, and now black plays a very good move, bishop e4. Bishop takes e4, king takes e4, b6. Virtually white's only trump now is to try and get a passed pawn. That's why he's worse in this endgame. Black has got a passed pawn and white has no passed pawn. So black has to be slightly concerned about white pushing his c pawn up all the way up the board. Fortunately for black, he's got the e pawn ready to roll, and f3 emphasises black's control of the position. After g takes f3, knight takes f3, white has got to waste a little bit of time dealing with black's threat of e2. He went knight d3, e2, and now c5. Knight e5, deflecting white's knight and driving him passive. King e3. The knight on c6, the knight on e5 covers c6 and controls the position. Knight c2 check, king f2, king d4, knight c6 check, king d5. White's only plan now is to run for c7, king f1, interesting move. King d6, of course, black's threat there was knight b4 check. So white's got to take a little bit of time out. Knight b4, again deflecting the knight fatally. Knight takes b4, and white simultaneously resigned because he can't stop black from queening. Going back, knight b4 is in effect the winning move. Without that, I think black would be struggling. But as it happens, knight b4 wins, because if white plays knight e3 in this position, the king just takes up the diagonal position, and once again we see that white is helpless against the passed pawn. So a very good introduction to this line. Black played consistently on the dark squares throughout, kept active, and stopped white from developing any real play whatsoever. Another game from 2010 now for you. This game is from the Madrid Championship. This was played in March 2010 between Jose Candela Perez, graded 2416, and Javier Moreno Ruiz, graded 2459. The opening moves will be very familiar to us, although actually the Foxy bind is reached in this game via the hyper-accelerated dragon. That's 2g6. Black plays this way if he's afraid of bishop b5. We just drop back. If black plays knight c6 in this position, then you have to have a good line against bishop b5. There's no place on this particular video to analyse this line, but perhaps in a future Foxy Openings video I'll turn my attention to this system, which is of course very important. By playing g6, black sidesteps that idea, but of course he's got to be aware that white can play in different ways against g6, perhaps the most noticeable of which is d4, c takes d4, and then queen takes d4. So there are pros and cons to black's move order. Fortunately in this game for us, Candela Perez plays c4, we get knight c6, d4, and then we get just transposition back into the main line. Bishop e3, knight f6, knight c3 castles, bishop e2, d6 castles, and now black plays bishop d7. Well, you can play this way, but if you do, you have to be aware that white can play knight c2 in this position. I slightly prefer going back one move, taking on d4 right away, bishop takes d4, and now only now bishop d7. I mean, this is a logical move order. It's been employed by Sergei Tiviakov among strong grandmasters, and I think Bent Larsen used it too in the past. And it basically gets what we want without having to think about knight c2. But, well, we go back to Candela Perez versus Moreno Ruiz. Bishop d7. White obviously didn't want to play knight c2 on that day, and now black just takes off on d4 and puts his bishop on c6. f3, and now our move a5, trying to control dark squares. The next component of the plan is to play knight d7. and white again refrains from the exchange of dark square bishops. We're going to see examples where white does take the bishops off. In general, they're slightly more comfortable for black than this particular line where white keeps the pieces on. Knight comes up to a nice square on c5, a nice outpost. Rook a b1, starting the slow process of advancing the queenside pawns. e6 by black, very interesting. Rook fd1 as in the last game, and now bishop comes to e5. Bishop f1, queen e7, we've seen this before, and now white tries to improve on the previous game by playing knight to e2. Now white is looking to exchange dark square bishops and attack the pawn on d6. So black defends his pawn with rook fd8. White goes knight f4. I think the point of that is that white feels that endgames will tend to favour him here. He's got the better pawn structure, and black's pawns on d6 and a5 are potentially weak. Therefore exchanges in this position would suit white, and knight f4 is probably just intending to drop back with knight d3 and exchange off a further pair of minor pieces. Black doesn't seem unduly concerned, he just reinforces the knight on c5. Queen comes to f2, and black plays calmly with rook a b8, anticipating knight d3 when he just drops back to g7. So black is approximately equal in this position. It's up to white to find a decent plan. Black has reasonable control of the dark squares here. Rook d2. Bishop takes e4. This move shows that black is not without his tactical opportunities in this position, and after captures on e4 and recaptures and queen e1, black decided to take on d2. Bishop takes d2. So we now reach an interesting material balance where, you know, white's got two pieces, black has a rook and two pawns. In general, the rook and two pawns are looking to exchange further pieces and go for the endgame. The rooks and pawns tend to show their strength in endgame situations. The pieces, they prefer the middle game. So white would like to keep in the middle game and try to find some way of attacking the black king, if he could. Fortunately for black, the king is solidly reinforced, and with d5, Marino Ruiz is starting the process of bringing his rooks into the game. White takes, plays knight f4, and black plays rook d6. Bishop c4, and now black coordinates his pieces with rook b d8. Okay, well this is just an interesting position. I mean, it's hard to call in the sense that, you know, one side or other has the advantage. I quite like black's game. I mean, I like the rooks and pawns here. Black's very well coordinated, and he's got strong control over the dark squares. If white could find an outpost for his knight in the centre, like we could move the knight to e5 here and keep it there, then perhaps white would have some claim to the advantage. But he can't really do that, and well, black continues to effect favourable exchanges here, heading for endgame situations with bishop d4. White cannot anchor his minor pieces. This is his problem. So black penetrates on the dark squares in this game very quickly by bringing his rook to d2 and his queen to e3. It's very thematic all the way through. White freezes back rank, and now black further activates his major pieces by bringing both rooks down to the 7th rank. We note that white has been completely unable to find stable squares for his minor pieces in the centre, and he has no attack against the black king. He tries with knight f4, black pins him. Rook f1, of course, white is really struggling in this position, and rook c1 just emphasises how active the black pieces have become. White's only move now is g3, black takes on f1, e5, I think this is the winning move in effect, knight g2, queen f2, and white resigns. A decisive double attack on the queen at h4 and the bishop on f1. Now, I'm not saying white overlooked that move, bishop takes e4, a little bit earlier, but possibly he misjudged the coming situation after that sacrifice. Again, a good game where white completely failed to make anything of his small space advantage. Black got active and played superbly with his major pieces throughout the conclusion of that game. Well, so far we've been looking at lines where white has been refraining from the exchange of dark square bishops. What happens in our main line when white takes off the bishop on g7? My next game is Andrei Sokolov versus Aldo Haig. Sokolov, at the time this game was played in 1985, was one of the best players in the world, and here he is playing a French international master. whom I'm sure he was expecting to beat with white. So the Moroxy is ideal, I think, for a stronger player who just wants to beat a weaker player using technique. White can grind away with his small spatial edge and hope to bore the pants off black, gradually grinding him down. Well, okay, as I stated before, I think it's slightly more accurate to take on d4 here, but Hake played bishop d7, white played queen d2, black took on d4 now and put his bishop on c6. Okay, this is the main line, f3 protecting the pawn, a5, both restraining white on the queen side and preparing to transfer the knight to c5, king h1, just a useful move. Well, white has other moves here, b3, rook a, b1, but it all comes to the same. Black's going knight d7. And now what should happen after bishop takes g7, king takes g7? Okay, well, positionally, this should favour black. As stated, black is trying to get a grip on the dark squares in this position. So, typically in this position, black could follow up by either deploying his queen to b6, or he may play a move like a4 and then deploy his queen to a5. White struggles to prove any advantage here because his bishop is so bad. He can't just grind away. It's very difficult to advance the queenside pawns in this position because, you know, black's got a strong grip on the queenside. Also, if white can't play this plan of advancing the queenside pawn, what plan has he got? Well, Sokolov had obviously decided that f4 was the right way to play this. Both, you know, intending to attack black on the king side now that the king has been slightly denuded by the exchange of bishops on g7, and creating a square on f3 for his bishop. So this move makes sense. But what Hake did also made sense, as he played a4, rook f3, and now queen a5. In this position, I think black has adequate play. White tried to attack the king. Sokolov is, well, and was a very aggressive player. King went back to g8, solid stuff. Queen came to e1, perhaps intending queen h4, and now black broke up white's kingside play with the move f5. It's pretty obvious that queen h4 can be defended very economically with knight f6 here, or even rook f7. Black can defend himself. After that, white's got to worry about the activity of the black queen. You know, the black queen can come to maybe b4, b6 or c5, and the white attack is running out of steam. So in the game, Sokolov decided to just make his bishop slightly better. Black brought his rook across to e8, queen h4, and now the economical move, rook f7. White to continue to try and open up the game, thinking that he got some sort of an attack, but queen takes f5 saw the white kingside initiative grinding to a halt, really. Knight d5. Okay, black was happy to remove that knight and just simply play e6. Rook e3, tactical, and black played a clever move now, knight e5. Well, the problem for white in this position is that if his attack breaks down, his queenside is actually very weak. Black's threatening to invade on the queenside with a move like queen c2, and the white pawn structure here is nothing to write home about. As usual, white's got this light square bishop. It's arguable that that bishop is very good. With knight e5, well, it's a very clever move. The main idea is that if white takes on e5 in this position, then black can go queen f1. So after knight e5, Sokolov played h3, freeing up his back rank. And now, of course, I was able to take over the game with queen takes f4, rook takes f4, bishop takes b7, and now knight takes c4. So whatever white was attempting to do in this particular variation has failed. Sokolov has limped into an endgame where he's a pawn down, and with really no chances of saving this endgame. Black's got this strong pass pawn duo in the centre, and white has no counterplay to speak of. So really it's a serious situation for white. The knight came to a beautiful square on e5. The rook activated and came down to c7. A rook like that shouldn't be allowed to stay on the board, so black was happy to try and exchange it off. Rook c8 check, rook takes, bishop takes. In general, in a position like this, you want to keep it simple. So a check followed by king f7, was black's way of saying to white, well, you've got nothing here. Rook e4 was answered by rook c1, a counter-attack on the bishop, and bishop a6 was answered by rook c2. Well, rook takes b2 is threatened. Knight f3 is an interesting option. Rook b4. It's all going to boil down in a moment to black advancing those central pawns. He's just got a little bit of technical tidying up to do, which he does by playing a3. B takes a3 is forced, rook takes a2, a4, and now the pawns advance. Really, this is the death knell for white, as he's got no answer to the advance of the central pawns in the long run. King f1 was answered by knight c6 and rook b7 check by king f6. Bishop b5 was answered by knight d4. This is the regrouping black was hoping to play. It further confines the white king. Black's rook is in an ideal spot, and once again the overall plan is just to advance the central pawns. White is clutching at straws with g4, and white unfortunately now has to go into a lost rook endgame with king e1, king e5, king d1, rook g2. It's a mop-up job. King c2, king d6. It really is very easy now. b7, rook e4. Game over. White's completely tied down, and he faces the simple move, king c7. So a rather unpleasant defeat for Sokolov, a grandmaster who perhaps was hoping to grind his lesser opponent down, but actually found to his cost that black's position contained more resources than he otherwise thought. I think the variation with bishop takes g7 is in general slightly better for black than it is if white retreats, as you've seen. I think we should be sensing by now that actually this system is pretty reliable for black. My next game shows white trying to play his Maroczy bind in a slightly different way. It's the game Hamduchi versus Tiviakov, played in Vaikensee in 2004. And again it features an exchange of bishops, dark square bishops on g7. The mainline moves are very familiar now. Tiviakov employs a slightly different move order to reach our desired position, but it is reached nonetheless, with black taking on d4, bishop d7, queen d2, bishop d6, bishop c6, excuse me, and now white deviates from f3 by playing bishop d3. This of course is a passive square for the bishop, but white intends, I think, to play f4 in one go. His intentions are far more aggressive in this position than otherwise with the move f3. The move f3 really is rather slow. When white plays with f3, he's kind of dependent on being able to advance his queenside pawns. Well, if black plays accurately, we've seen that black can throw up some pretty serious roadblocks in white's way. So white changes tack and goes for the attack on the black king, or the supposed attack. No matter, black should play a5. That very useful move, securing dark squares on the queen side and preparing to play knight d7. Rook a e1 was played by Hamduchi, and a4 was played by Tiviakov, a slight deviation from the norm, but he's seen the white rook moving to e1 rather than b1, so he decides to give himself the option of playing queen a5, if desired. Well, white played knight d5. I think if white had played f4, black would certainly have availed himself of the opportunity to play queen a5. This looks reasonable for black. So a4, knight d5 was played, and now knight d7. This is the key move, and in this case forced because black had to monitor b6. Well, white takes off the bishops. This is all part of his grand plan to attack the king, and now Hamduchi brings the rook into e3. Well, obviously black's got to be careful in this position. You know, white's threatening rook h3 and some sort of big attack going there. Fortunately for black, now that the dark square bishops are off, he's got a solid positional rejoinder in e5. The point of e5 is to secure the dark squares once again. Black is planning the knight transfer if he's got time. Knight to c5, knight back to e6, and then solid control over f4 and d4. So white's got to get on with the job, lest black simply take over the position by playing in this manner. Therefore, rook h3, h5, and now knight came to e3. hoping to join the fray. Well, going back, if white plays knight c3, I think black just goes in with knight c5 and gets on with his plan. White's got no real attack there. Is he really going to play g4 in this position? I don't think so. Going back to h5, I wondered about the move g4 straight away. Black should certainly take on d5 against that, and against e takes d5 we go knight f6. This is a very solid way to defend the king, and white can't make inroads against it. If he tries f4 we take, queen takes, well, black's got this solid control again. Queen b6 check, king h1, and now rook a e8. How does white get through? So that would be a good way for black to both defend and create counterplay at the same time. So going back to the game, Handucci preferred knight e3, and Tiviakov put his knight up on c5. White went f4. White's got to try and disrupt this black plan, and black took on e4. A very sharp move, but Tiviakov was never a player to fear complications, especially if he feels they're, moving in his favour. White gets on with the job, sacrificing a piece, and knight takes d3 was answered by f6 check. I'm sure both players had seen, well, they thought they'd seen a long way in this position. And knight g4 does, in fact, look extremely dangerous. White's threatening queen h6 check, followed by mate. And black must respond very energetically against this move. Well, queen b6 check was Tiviakov's intention in this position. That's a very disruptive move, and rather awkward for white to meet. White went king h1. Bishop takes g2 check. This is the saving grace, and well, I think it's a move which white perhaps had overlooked or underestimated. He took with the queen in the game. Possibly he was intending to take with the king, but then comes queen takes b2, rook takes d3. Both players have calculated a long way. The queen's come off, white's knight is removed, white takes on d6, and now rook a c8. And we get a rook endgame which should be very favourable to black. Black's a pawn up, well, in fact he's 2 pawns up in this position. It feels like he's only 1 pawn up, but in fact he's 2 pawns up. And well, the pawn on c4 is very weak and can't be defended really by normal means. So this should be a winning endgame for black. Going back to the game, bishop takes g2, queen takes g2. Now black puts his knight on f4. Very well placed, cutting out the white queen. Rook takes f4 was, let's say, consistent. Rook takes h5, white's going all in this position. G takes h5, queen e4, and now the very accurate move here, king g8. A move which actually avoids a final pitfall in this position. If black had erroneously gone king h8 in this position, then white can simply play queen takes f4. And if queen c6 check, king g1. Suddenly it's black who's in trouble in this position, as queen h6 check is looking fatal. So black's got to keep checking here. Queen c5 check, king f1, and I think the king is avoiding the checks in this position. So that is definitely not what black wants to happen. But fortunately for Tiviakov, king g8 is well calculated, and now white has to beat the retreat. He went knight e3. Well, going back, of course, if he plays queen takes f4 in this position, it's all very different. We can play queen c6 check, king g1, queen c5 check, king f1, and now rook a5. The fact that the king's on g8 makes all the difference, as there's no check on h6. Therefore, black threatens queen f5, or a liquidation, which white can't stop. So going back to the game, knight e3 was answered by queen takes b2, and that was that. White resigned. The attack evaporates after queen takes f4, queen e5. So another game there where the bishops were exchanged, but really this exchange of dark square bishops feels like it's nothing to fear for black. In fact, given black's overall strategy of playing on the dark squares, I would say that this exchange plays into black's hands. Well, there's one other line to consider, and typically the critical position occurs when black offers the exchange of dark squared bishops. This seems to be the focal point for interest in this line. The opening moves we should know by now. Back to front, d6, castles, and now I've mentioned and reiterated throughout this video that knight takes d4 is probably the most accurate move in this position, and that after bishop d7, as played in our featured game, white could certainly consider the move knight c2. I'm not saying this is a variation which guarantees white an advantage, just that black can sidestep even thinking about it by taking on d4 the move before. Anyway, in the game Ashton versus Williams, Hastings Masters 2007, black played bishop d7 and white just plays as he normally does, queen d2, without really giving knight c2 a second thought. Anyway, black takes on d4, plays his bishop to c6 in approved fashion. White defends, black plays a5, grabbing dark squares, preparing to transfer the knight to c5 as we've seen, and now Ashton plays bishop f2. This is the difference between bishop takes g7 and bishop e3, as we've previously seen. Not sure of the advantages of bishop f2 over bishop e3, other than to say, well, perhaps it looks a bit safer on f2. That's all you can say. Black should certainly continue with his plan, knight c5, and white went rook a b1. So white's evidently intending to go on with his queenside pawn advance and stations his bishop as securely as he can on f2. That's what it looks like. Well, it turns out that it's not as easy as Ashton thinks to get those queenside pawns going, because after a3, black now played a4, and this is a very disruptive move for white to have to meet. Just when white was looking forward to going b4 without too many tears, black throws a spanner in the works, and after b4, knight b3, you're going to see in this game black developing a very surprising amount of activity from what actually looks like a slightly better position for white with his greater control of space. Black's trumps, well, this knight in the middle of white's guts and control over d4. This is why I think white plays queen d3 to try and retain control of the d4 square, but black continues to emphasise his control of the dark squares in the centre with queen f6, and this is a slightly awkward move to meet, because white's natural move in this position, let's face it, is rook fc1. That's what he would like to play. Of course he can't do that because black's got this big juicy knight on b3 stopping him. So Ashton played knight a2, and this move, decentralising, gives Williams the chance to show his superb tactical strength. Simon Williams is in general a very original and daring player. He likes nothing more than to create tactical situations on the board. So d5 would be manna from heaven for him. At a stroke, black opens the position on the light squares and tries to say to white, really, that all his pieces are awkwardly placed and could fall prey to black's light square bishop. Is that hard to believe? Well, let's see. In the game, white plays c5. Again, he's trying to win this game without tears. Pushing the pawns, queenside majority, let's push those pawns. But going back, if c takes d5, black has the surprising move here, bishop d7. And this is very awkward for white to meet. Bishop f5 is the threat. White certainly doesn't want to play g4 here. But if he goes rook bd1, trying to extract the rook out of the way, queen comes into b2. Now the knight on c3, the knight on a2 is very poorly placed. It can't come to c3. It's got to go to c1, which is a horrible square. Rook fe1, fe8, hammering away. Rook fe1, and now just queen takes a3. Black regains his pawn. He's far more active, and well, the white pieces are not really doing anything in this position. So that would be a variation which sees black exploding into life. So Ashton, going back to the game, tries to shut things down with c5, bishop d7, and now he plays g4. That's not a happy move for white, because, well, of course, he's loosening his king. Black continues to bring all his pieces into play. Rook fe1, and now Williams hits with h5. This was the drawback, of course, to g4. If G takes H5 in this position, black at the very least has Queen G5 check, avoiding any damage to his pawn structure. So white plays knight C1, hoping to keep things intact. Knight comes into D4. Bishop takes D4, another unhappy move. Off comes the queen. King F1, H takes G4, F takes G4, and now rook E4. White is being kept at bay by black's very active pieces. And of course that bishop on D4 is really worth its weight in gold in this position. Bishop F3 was answered by bishop B5 check, and bishop E2 by rook A E8. This really is a crushing blow, as the bishop on E2 is now pinned fatally and the white king is about to be stripped apart. So rather than let himself be crushed by William's activity, Ashton decided to resign. One very short variation will show you why he resigns. If he plays knight D3, rook takes E2, and bishop takes D3, forks and or pins all of white's pieces. So a horrible experience for white, but perhaps bishop F2 is a rather slow move, and Williams showed how to play against it in this excellent game. I've mentioned on occasion on this DVD that there are various ways for both white and black to get into the accelerated dragon Maroczy bind position, and one of these is via the move knight F3. Should black play C5, white can play C4, and after knight C6 white can go D4. You can see how this move order gravitates towards the Maroczy bind, as after G6 white is tempted to play E4. Bishop G7, and now we're going to take a look, before we leave this subject, at knight C2. This is a move which is finding favour with many grandmasters these days, as white tires of banging his head against a brick wall, for instance against the classical main line, and maybe even against the sharp system which I recommended at the front of this DVD. There is simply an awful lot to know with white if you play the Maroczy bind these days. So white decides to sidestep mainline theory in a way, keeps the pieces on with knight C2, which in itself is logical, and steers the game into perhaps a slightly more unusual position than the one we're accustomed to. Now, what should black do against this approach? Well, okay, white's approach is slow. That's the defect of knight C2, but it's logical. White keeps the pieces on and tries to emphasise his control of space. In my view, a good system for black starts with knight H6. We return now to our old friend that we saw at the beginning of this DVD, and black intends to play very sharply with a quick F5. This was seen in the game Jingarova versus Oleg Gladisev, 2480, in the Tarragona Open in 2007. And we will quickly see that black develops quite a bit of activity with this interesting move. Jingarova played knight C3, and black castled. And after bishop G5, which is an unusual move in its own right, black played F takes E4, which was answered by queen D5 check. So white has been jarred out of the normal positional channels into something altogether more tactical. The disadvantage of this position from white's point of view is that, as I've said, it's rather slow, and that knight on C2 is struggling to get back into the game. So black must keep the tactics on the boil in this line and stay as active as he can. Hence, after E6, queen takes E4, Gladisev hit out with D5. I should mention in this game that the black player was 200 ELO points higher rated than his opponent. So black wants to win this game. E takes D5, C takes D5, E takes D5. And now if white takes on D5, she finds that the pawn on B2 is hanging beyond the knight. Black's also threatening bishop F5 in this position. So white's got to be pretty careful what she does. She played queen A4, D4, and rook D1. Bishop D7. Well, suddenly white is in quite a lot of trouble in this position. The problem is she simply forked on C3 and E3, and she can't resolve the position by taking on D4, because after knight takes D4, black's bishop attacks white's queen. So I think that white has simply been bamboozled by black's very active approach in this game, and her next move, castles, was pretty abject. Black played queen c8, excellent tactical control, getting the queen off the dangerous d file, and knight d5 was answered by d takes e3. Knight c takes e3. Well, at this stage, you know, white is clutching at straws. I mean, she can play a move like queen takes c6, but then just bishop takes c6, knight e7, king h8, knight takes queen. Well, we can flick in e takes f2 check if we want to, and on the next turn, black will take on c8, retaining an extra piece. So, going back to the game, white tried knight c takes e3, but king h8 was another comfortable move by black, just tucking the king out of harm's way, and, well, just saying to white, well, I'm a piece up for nothing, which in effect he is. Knight h6, g4, black was going knight f5, bishop e6, rook d2, it's very comfortable now for black. Vladislav just simply exchanges pieces, white avoids the exchange of queens, in comes the knight, very nicely played, queen g2, knight takes e2, check, knight takes g4, everything's going down the drain now, rook fe1, knight h6, rook e7, knight f5, and this really sounds the death knell for white. She tried rook takes g7, but knight takes g7 left her a rook down. Going back one move, what else is there? Well, I suppose there's a move like rook takes b7 in this position, but you know, black is a piece up, and well, perhaps the simplest move of all will be something like rook a b8. Black trades the pieces, and he's left in total command. So white was obviously surprised by black's aggressive approach in this game. Shall we see another game, and let's try to examine whether white can do better. It's my strong impression that many players who employ the Maroczy bind expect an automatic advantage out of the opening. They read in the theory books that the Maroczy is the way to play against the accelerated dragon. You know, white gets this space advantage in the centre, an automatic grip on the game, easy development for his pieces, and it's as simple as that. Well, as we've seen, it's not as simple as that at all, because black has plenty of active ways to play against the Maroczy bind, and some of these are quite uncomfortable for white. Now, it seems to me that, of course, it's our job with black not to make the opponent's life easy, isn't it? So, it's my impression that knight c2, whilst it's a logical move in many respects, is rather slow, and black can take advantage of this by sticking to the idea with knight h6 and going through with f5 as quickly as he can. We saw what sort of psychological effect it could have on white in the last game, where white played rather poorly right from the outset of the game. Now we come to the game Brzezinski versus Plichta, played in Poland in 2009, where white played more conventionally, let's say, with knight c3 and then bishop e2. Black played d6 and white castle. So white sets up the basic Maroczy position, and now black breaks with our favourite move, f5. I should mention that the white player is 350 ELO points higher rated than his opponent, so black might have felt that he had nothing to lose in this game, but actually goes on to score a very convincing victory using this active system. I think the line with knight h6 and f5 is a jolly good answer to knight c2. Well, white did not like the idea of taking on f5, bringing black's knight into the game, so he went knight e3, and now black pushed on with f4. After knight g4, black took the knight and entrenched his own knight on e5. White took on c8, black recaptured, and now of course we see that black has emerged from the opening in very good shape. Black's attacking the pawn on c4 twice, which is very difficult to defend. Black's also threatening in this position f3, which is inconvenient for white's king, and white has no corresponding plan to set against these ideas. Okay, we can set a sort of cheapo with knight d5, but queen takes c4, knight takes e7 check, and now the very forcing move, king f7, which I'm sure white underestimated, is excellent for black. Plichta plays the rest of this game very dynamically, as white puts the knight back on d5, and now black pushes on with f3. This is a very damaging move for the white king to have to face, and it's entirely thematic and in keeping with our active approach against knight c2. G takes f3 is just about forced, and now black simply tucks his king away, ready for the onslaught against the white king, starting with knight takes f3 check. White played f4, the knight came into d3, and the queen came to b3. Queen takes b3, black changes tack, has no hesitation in doing so because he sees new advantages. He swaps the advantage of the attack for a positional advantage. Now black's going to regain his pawn, and the white pawn structure is really nothing to write home about. Rook a4 was answered by a5, and knight b6 was answered by rook a6. Bishop e3 was then answered by knight c5. And suddenly, white saw that actually b2 was hanging, a4 was hanging, and b6 was hanging. In all cases, white doesn't have a particularly good game. He tried b3. I'm sure this finish came as a complete shock to white. Probably what white was intending to do here was to take on c5. Then we recapture. The knight on b6 is in trouble. If knight c4, we can go, I think, b5. Going back to position after d takes c5. If knight d5, then I think we can simply go bishop takes b2. In both cases, black is in very good shape. So, in the game, knight c5, b3, rook takes b6 was the amazing conclusion. White suddenly found to his consternation that he was a piece down, and therefore resigned. What a triumph for the player graded 350 elo points lower rated than his opponent. So I think we've seen in our two games exploring the line with knight c2 that knight h6 can have considerable psychological impact on the opponent. White won't be expecting it. He just wants to sit down, play solid chess and eke out a small edge. We don't give him that time. We're going to attack with f5, we're going to go for the initiative, and we're going to try and shake white up. This interesting game brings me to the conclusion of this opening DVD in the Accelerated Dragon series. I hope you've enjoyed the games on this DVD, and that you can now go out and face the Maroczy bind with some confidence. The Maroczy bind is therefore to be respected but not feared. It's time to move on to volume 2.